people like me. You need people like me so you can point your f***ing fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
Welcome to the mother relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. It's officially fight week for former IBF super lightweight champion Mary Mcgee, who will be taking on veteran journeywoman from the Dominican Republic, Diana Santana, in the quest for her 28th professional win from Milwaukee, Wisconsin this Saturday night. It's been a long time since we saw Mary, who was last in action well over a year ago in October of 2021 opposite the ring current reigning champion Chantel Kimron in what was their unification match. Unfortunately, Mary was unable to get a fight in last year. She sat out all of last year, and she's set to return to action early this year, this Saturday, in what is being billed as a welterweight contest, a six-rounder. I figured Mary Mcgee, having campaigned in the super lightweight division and having sat out for so long, it was conceivable that upon her return, she would be moving up in weight, moving up to welterweight, where Jessica McCaskill still is the authority. She's still the woman to beat. At 147 pounds, she is. At 140, she dropped a lopsided decision to Chantel Kimron, a common opponent between Jessica and Mary. Yeah, Mary's fight with Chantel was a lot more competitive than Jessica, and now Mary's going to be opposite the ring veteran journeywoman Diana Santana. Diana, who sports a professional record of 40 wins with 13 losses, no draws, 16 knockouts, having only ever been knocked out 4 times. 4 times in 53 professional contests. 4 times in 53 professional bouts. It's conceivable that she may be knocked out for the 5th time this weekend. Opposite the ring, Mary Mcgee, the hard-punching Mary Mcgee, merciless Mary Mcgee from Gary, Indiana, who sports a professional record of 27 wins with 4 losses, no draws, 15 knockouts, having never been knocked out. Having never been knocked out in 32 professional contests. 32 professional bouts, could be 33 this upcoming weekend. You don't knock out Mary Mcgee. Still very high on Mary, and I'm not going to apologize for that. Mary Mcgee is one of my favorite fighters at or around these weights. She's an action fighter, a hard puncher, an experienced veteran, and a former champion. She's been around a long time. You wouldn't know it to look at her. She debuted as a professional in 2005. A career that spans nearly 2 decades, just short of 2 decades. 18 years, approximately 17 to 18 years in the pro ranks. Mary's a special fighter, and you have to be a special fighter to beat her. A Holly Holm, an Erica Farias, Chantel Kimron, that kind of fighter. You have to compete at a certain level to beat Mary. Otherwise, Mary's gonna beat you. Mary Mcgee, who's looking to rebound off that decision loss to Chantel Kimron in October of 2021. Usually it's the other way around. Usually it's Diana Santana coming off of a loss or consecutive losses, where it's here, it's Mary that's doing the rebounding. Diana is coming off 4 consecutive victories, 3 decision wins, and 1 knockout. Knockout win in her last fight. It's quite uncommon that Diana Santana is coming off of consecutive victories ahead of a fight like this. Usually she's coming off consecutive losses, as she's shared the ring with some of the best and brightest fighters in the entire sport of women's boxing. You're talking about fighters like Amanda Serrano, Melissa St. Ville, Tiaria Brown, former champion Eva Wallstrom, former champion Ana E. Esther Sanchez, Diana Santana. The list goes on. There's not a lot in women's boxing that she hasn't seen already. So as a result of this, more often than not, Diana Santana herself is usually coming off consecutive losses. This time, she's coming off consecutive victories over pedestrian-level competition, pedestrian-level opponents, journeywomen with upside-down records. Thus, I've no illusions of what's about to happen to Diana Santana this upcoming Saturday. I anticipate that Mary Mcgee, like Amanda Serrano before her, will stop Diana Santana and get herself back in the winner's bracket. This being a welterweight contest, it's conceivable that she may be targeting a Jessica McCaskill fight. Jessica McCaskill, a long-standing domestic rival for Mary Mcgee. She's still the woman to beat at 147 pounds, and she may currently be under orders to face former IBF welterweight champion Ivana Habazin. We've talked about that in my previous videos. This may be a bid on Mary Mcgee's part to corner a fight with Jessica McCaskill, or at minimum, pick up a newly vacated title should one become available, which could see Mary Mcgee becoming a two-division champion. Mary Mcgee, who is a bit of an anomaly, she's actually several years younger than Jessica, even though she's been around longer. She's a very experienced professional, a veteran, a former champion, and it's conceivable that if she stays active this year, she can either get a title shot or pick up a vacant one. Here's hoping that this year turns out to be a more productive year for Mary than last year was. She's going to be in action this weekend opposite the ring Diana Santana, and I am going with Mary Mcgee to win. At minimum, I think she can win on points. At most, I think she can stop Diana. In men's welterweight news, Ennis says Chukatsian really didn't come to fight, and there's nothing we can do about that. I do agree with that contention, that Chukatsian was more content surviving than trying to win rounds, though the idea that there was really nothing that Jaron Boots Ennis could have done about it, I disagree. He did his best. He did what he could do about it. He just didn't look that good in the eyes of some. A few. Well, you've got a guy who really didn't come to fight. Ennis's father, trainer, said, you know what I mean? So that's why I told my son to walk him down. Try to make him fight, but he still didn't want to fight. So ain't nothing we can do about that, you know? There was a soundbite ahead of the fight from Bozy stating that they don't watch footage on their opponents. They don't watch the tape on the guys they're about to fight. So is it possible that they went into this fight not knowing that Chukatsian would and could make himself a moving target for the majority of the fight? And if that's the case, were they underprepared? Were they expecting him to go about fighting the fight like Thomas Dulorme did or Sergey Lipinets? Because if they did, then that misstep would have been on their end. Bozy continued, what we had to do was keep on doing what we was doing. We won every round, so I'm glad we went 12 rounds, and y'all see, he wasn't even tired. The younger Ennis expressed disappointment that he didn't knock out such a huge underdog. It's a lot of things that I could have done better, Jaron Ennis said. You know, cut the ring off a little. Cut the ring off a little better, stay a little sharper, not looking. Looking for the knockout. It wasn't necessarily looking for the knockout, just more having fun. Jaron Ennis has been on the receiving end of some criticism for this performance this past weekend because even though he won every round, he really didn't look impressive. It's not dissimilar from what we saw in Ryan Garcia opposite Emmanuel Tagoe, where Ryan and Garcia versus Tagoe, like Ennis versus Chukatsi, and Ryan Garcia was opposite the ring a moving target who would not engage. He wasn't trying to win the rounds per se, he was just trying to survive. He spent most of the fight on the balls of his feet, moving laterally. Chukatsian did something very similar. And in the case of Ryan, like in the case of Boots, Jaron, even though he won virtually every single round, people were not impressed. And as stated, there was a soundbite ahead of the fight where Bozy Ennis, Jaron Ennis' father and trainer, stated quite plainly that they don't watch footage on their opponents ahead of a fight. So from where I'm sitting, it's entirely possible that they may not have been adequately prepared for a moving target that can stay a moving target for the full course, for the full 12 rounds. And as a result of that, there are those out there that want you to believe that Jaron Boots Ennis is the heir apparent to the welterweight throne, that he'd beat Virgil Ortiz, that he'd even beat Terence Crawford, a far more accomplished, seasoned fighter than Jaron Boots Ennis is here today. There are those people. That is largely in part why there's been so much scrutiny placed on this performance, that if you want us to believe that he is that ilk of fighter and he is capable of what someone like a Terence Crawford is capable of, well then surely he should be able to dispatch an unheralded, massive underdog like a Karen Chukatsian, and he didn't. I don't think Karen Chukatsian goes 12 with Terence Crawford. I don't think he goes 12 with Virgil Ortiz. I think... You know what I think? I think Jaron Boots Ennis only saw action once last year, and he only fought for a grand total of 4 minutes. I think that he's not active enough. I think that not watching footage on his opponents, that also has something to do with it. In spite of his reputation, he really hasn't seen the best and brightest fighters this division has to offer. It's because Because of his reputation, that his previous performance is under such scrutiny, because they want you to believe that this guy's right up there with Terrence Crawford, and he's a credible threat to him when he could not dispatch a Karen Chukatsian.
That's a tough sell.
Jaron Boots Ennis has a lot of fights, approximately 30, 25 years old, but he very much still seems like a fighter that is developing.
Might sound strange given how many fights he has.
But when you take a closer look at who he's actually been fighting, what you come to realize is he hasn't fought any world-class fighters, any world-class movers and jabbers, any world-class punchers or combination punchers. He has not fought any world-class fighter.
Irrespective of his reputation, irrespective of the hyperbole associated with him, this is a guy who hasn't fought anybody who's world-class.
Who he has fought, irrespective of how many times he's fought in those kinds of fights, who he has fought are guys he's widely favored to beat. So it's entirely possible that he's still developing as a fighter, irrespective of having something like 30 professional fights. There's not really a single world-class fighter among the 30.
And Karen Chukatsian doesn't automatically become that just because he made Boots look ordinary.
Because Karen Chukatsian, like Jaron Boots Ennis, he hasn't faced any world-class fighters either.
Already had a loss on his record.
It wasn't to a world-class fighter, a world-class guy, a former champion, or a top 10 rated consensus top 10 welterweight in the world. These are not the kind of fighters that Jaron Boots Ennis is fighting, and because he's not fighting frequently enough,
Tack that on.
I didn't readily crown him the heir apparent to the welterweight throne based on a number of factors. The politics.
What fights with what fighters will be made available to him based on those politics? What fighters will be willing to share the ring with him in tandem with the promotional situation he has?
Keith's supposed to be fighting Errol. Danny moved up to junior middleweight.
Virgil Ortiz is on another side of the street, and Terrence Crawford, if what the Showtime people want is a Crawford versus Ennis fight, it's up to Showtime to make the offer.
Getting Jaron Ennis high-profile fights looks like it's going to be difficult, and I feel like the most that Cameron Duncan, his promoter, and Stephan Espinoza, Showtime executive Stephan Espinoza, who is so invested in the career of Jaron Boots Ennis, I think the most they can do for him is at least keep him busy, at least keep him active. Maybe you can't get him big fights and high-profile fights, but that shouldn't stop you from getting him out there 3 times. Get him out there with a Butayev. Get him out there with a Josecito Lopez.
Get him Roman Villa, who just upset the apple cart for Rashidi Ellis.
Then unbeaten Rashidi Ellis. These are not the kind of opponents that you have to break the bank in order to secure. These should be relatively inexpensive fights.
You don't think these guys are going to want an arm and a leg to fight Boots?
They might, but you still don't have to pay them what you'd have to pay a Danny Garcia or a Keith Thurman.
It should be relatively inexpensive
Compared to what you'd have to pay some other fighters. Moreover, if Showtime truly is invested in this guy and trying to turn him into a star, they have to pay to play. They have to invest.
Can't shelf him for the better portion of a year the way they did last year.
Won't turn him into a star doing that. Moreover, as a fighter, on that kind of schedule, he might start to regress.
He might.
Roman Villa seems the obvious choice for Jaron Ennis' next fight whenever that goes down. This year shouldn't come and go without Jaron Boots Ennis seeing action at least 3 times.
Wouldn't be the story that it is that Jaron Boots Ennis went 12 rounds with a guy he was widely favored to starch, if not for those who hype him up.
Guys that tell you he's the best thing smoking, and he beats everybody. He didn't look like a world beater in there with Karen Chukatsian, throwing single jabs that
Wasn't able to land meaty punches on Karen Chukatsian, and I'm sorry to say it's really not because of how great Karen Chukatsian is.
maybe it's because Boots needs to be more active, and maybe, just maybe, it's because you guys jumped the gun, and he might not be everything you think he is.
Too much hype.
And just in keeping with the theme of all things Showtime, in reference to this past weekend's fights, Stephan Espinoza took to his social media during the show and said, and some of y'all said this fight was a mismatch. You know who you are. Mad because it's a competitive fight, yet you call yourself a boxing fan. Hashtag Davis Garcia, hashtag Ellis Villa.
Ahead of this past weekend show, the reception that it got, the undercard fight.
Most people said they were tune-up fights. That was how they were received. You know, Demetrius Andrade versus a career journeyman in Desmond Nicholson. Unbeaten Rashidi Ellis versus an unheralded Roman Villa.
Unbeaten Jaron Ennis versus a massive underdog in Karen Chukatsian.
What Stephan Espinoza is essentially saying is that because the fight turned out to be competitive, the Rashidi Ellis versus Roman Villa fight, that it wasn't a mismatch.
Maybe he's right.
But even if he is, you know what that makes that fight? That makes it a cherry pick gone wrong. Ahead of this weekend's action, it was widely reported that Rashidi Ellis was offered a Jaron Boots Ennis fight, which would have been a more ambitious fight and a more titillating fight for the co-main event to the main event. It was widely reported that he was offered that fight and he rejected it due to the money.
Before that, he was offered Virgil Ortiz back when he was still with Golden Boy. They offered him Virgil, and it was the same thing.
He didn't like the money. So when he fights a lesser fighter, a guy who don't exhibit the ceiling of either a Virgil Ortiz or a Jaron Boots Ennis, irrespective of the fight turning out to be competitive,
all that makes it is a cherry pick gone wrong.
let's not pretend that this was ambitious matchmaking. Moreover, let's not pretend that this wasn't a pay-per-view.
This wasn't your run-of-the-mill Showtime fight. This wasn't an ordinary fight. This was a fight that came with a hefty $75 price tag.
You're gonna ask people to pay that in order to see the show, in order to see the card. The matchmaking really does need to be more ambitious. The matches themselves, they need to be more attractive. And I think a battle of the unbeatens ahead of the fight, a battle of the unbeatens between Rashidi Ellis and Jaron Boots Ennis would have been more adequate for a co-main event to the main event. As it stands, you put him in there with Roman Villa.
You guys put him in there with that guy because you were expecting him to lose, not because you thought the fight would be competitive.
Rashidi Ellis and his team's own logic. They decided to go in there with Roman Villa as opposed to a Jaron Boots Ennis because they were expecting an easier fight. They were expecting.
They figured we can beat this guy before we can beat a Jaron Boots Ennis.
This is a revisionist version of history, if it's anything, because Rashidi Ellis, an unbeaten up-and-comer, then an unbeaten up-and-comer, rejected 2 fights with 2 blue-chip prospects before he landed on Roman Villa. And he didn't land on Roman Villa because it was a high-profile fight, because there was a lot at stake, because there was a lot to gain. He landed on that guy.
If these guys that are massive underdogs going into the fight end up putting up more of a fight than originally anticipated, that doesn't make the matchmaking ambitious.
Because you knew why you made those fights when you made them. You made those fights to try and make those fighters look good.
When they don't end up looking good, that doesn't change that.
If it's anything, it's an indictment on your grooming process. The grooming process you have for your fighters and your unbeaten up-and-comers. That's all that is. It's an indictment.
You can put these guys in showcase fights, try and make them look good, and they still don't.
You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of the Charlo versus Montiel fight over a year ago in 2021. When they made that fight, that wasn't the best fight that they could have made for Jermall Charlo. It was the easiest fight. But based on the performance, what they started to say...
They started carrying on about how tough Juan is, and bear in mind that he was already knocked out years prior to that fight by Jaime Munguia.
Based on the aesthetic of the Charlo fight, the fact that Jermall, he really didn't look good with that guy. He didn't have it all his way with him. They tried to tell you...
Because Jermall couldn't stay in character, they tried talking up Montiel, defending the matchmaking.
That same Montiel that's supposed to be this really tough guy based on Jermall struggling with him, he couldn't do anything with Carlos Adames. Carlos Adames, Jaime Munguia, they did what you're supposed to do with Juan Macias Montiel. Charlo didn't.
And that doesn't mean that Juan is great. That means that Charlo isn't.
Apply that same formula to Ellis versus Villa. If Villa upsets the apple cart for Rashidi Ellis, it's not necessarily because of how great Roman Villa is. It's because of how great Rashidi Ellis isn't.
It was a cherry pick gone wrong if it was anything.